They called them the Epstein files, and for years, those words have carried a strange mix of curiosity, anger, and unease. Because this isn't just a story about one man. It's about power, influence, money, and the uncomfortable question of how much can stay hidden when the right people are involved. Jeffrey Epstein didn't start out famous. In fact, his early life looked surprisingly ordinary compared to where he eventually ended up. Born in Brooklyn, New York, he showed strong academic ability, especially in math. He even taught at a prestigious private school for a short time, despite not having a college degree. From there, he moved into finance, a world where connections often matter as much as talent. And somehow, he rose quickly. Very quickly. Soon, he was managing money for wealthy clients. No one was ever entirely clear on exactly how he made all of it, but the results were obvious. Mansions in New York and Palm Beach. A private island in the Caribbean. Luxury jets. Elite social circles. And those circles were impressive. Politicians, business leaders, celebrities, academics, royalty, people whose names carried global recognition. Photos of Epstein alongside influential figures would later fuel endless speculation. At the time, though, many simply saw him as another wealthy financier with powerful friends. But beneath that polished image, allegations were slowly building. Some young women began saying they had been recruited, sometimes by other young women, to visit Epstein's homes. They were promised money, opportunities, mentorship. What they described afterward was something very different. Accounts varied, but common themes appeared. Manipulation, coercion, abuse, trafficking. For years, those voices struggled to be heard loudly enough. Stories surfaced locally, then faded. Rumors circulated, but nothing seemed to stick permanently. Until 2005. Police in Palm Beach, Florida, began investigating after a complaint from a teenager's family. The investigation uncovered multiple allegations. Detectives reportedly identified numerous potential victims. And suddenly, what had been whispers became something much harder to ignore. Yet what happened next shocked many observers. In 2008, Epstein reached a plea agreement with federal prosecutors. Instead of facing potentially severe federal charges, he pleaded guilty to lesser state charges. He served about 13 months in custody, but under conditions critics later described as unusually lenient. Work release privileges. Extensive time outside jail. Minimal long-term consequences compared to the seriousness of allegations. The deal also granted immunity to some potential associates, a detail that would later trigger intense scrutiny. At the time, the case seemed to close, but public frustration quietly simmered. Some journalists kept digging. Some victims kept speaking. And over the years, investigative reporting began revealing details many people had never seen before. One major turning point came when reporters uncovered the full scope of the original plea agreement and how unusual it appeared compared to typical federal cases. Questions multiplied. Why had the deal been so lenient? Who knew what and when? Had influence played a role? Meanwhile, civil lawsuits continued. Victims sought accountability through the courts, even when criminal proceedings had stalled. And slowly, public attention returned. By 2019, everything changed again. Federal prosecutors in New York announced new charges. Sex trafficking of minors. This time, the allegations were detailed, extensive, and impossible for major media to ignore. Epstein was arrested at an airport in New Jersey. Within hours, global headlines exploded. Suddenly, people everywhere were talking about him again. And about something else too. Documents. Court filings. Flight logs. Contact books. Testimonies. Records from past investigations. Collectively, people began calling them the Epstein files. For some, these documents represented hope. The hidden truths might finally surface. For others, they represented frustration. Because many records were sealed, redacted, or legally restricted, every partial release sparked waves of speculation. Names appeared, sometimes simply because of social contact or business connections. Legal experts repeatedly emphasized, appearing in a document doesn't equal guilt. But public curiosity didn't fade. Then came August 2019. Epstein was found dead in his jail cell while awaiting trial. Officials ruled it suicide. Yet the circumstances raise serious concerns. Reported security lapses, malfunctioning cameras, guarding irregularities. Almost immediately, debate erupted worldwide. Some accepted the official conclusion. Others questioned it intensely. And without a trial, many victims felt a crucial chance for full accountability had vanished. Still, the story didn't end there. Investigations into associates, institutions, and alleged enablers continued in various forms. Civil litigation moved forward, and document releases kept happening, slowly, sometimes years apart. Each release added pieces to a puzzle that still feels incomplete. For survivors, the focus has often been recognition and justice. For journalists, it's transparency. For the public, it's understanding how such a network could exist for so long. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect is this. Many people believe cases like this reveal systemic issues. How wealth, influence, and reputation can sometimes delay scrutiny. That doesn't mean every powerful person is involved in wrongdoing. But it does raise questions about accountability structures. Questions society is still trying to answer. Because ultimately, the Epstein files aren't just about documents. They represent a complicated intersection of crime allegations, legal processes, media investigation, and public trust. And even now, years later, discussions continue. Court cases continue. Records continue to surface. But full closure, that remains uncertain. Some stories end cleanly. This one probably never will. Because beyond the headlines and controversy, there are real people whose lives were affected. And systems still being examined to prevent something similar from happening again. And maybe that's why the Epstein files still capture attention. Not just because of what they reveal, but because of what they suggest about power, secrecy, and accountability in the modern world. And as more documents slowly surfaced, public attention shifted from just one individual to a much bigger question. How systems react when wealth and influence are involved. Because cases like this don't happen in isolation. They exist within legal systems, social circles, institutions, and media environments that all play a role in what gets exposed and what stays hidden. Journalists began revisiting old leads. Some stories that once seemed minor suddenly looked far more significant in hindsight. Former associates were questioned again. Flight logs were analyzed repeatedly. Legal filings were studied line by line. But one thing became clear very quickly. Documentation can show connections, but it doesn't always show context. And that distinction matters. A name appearing in records might mean business contact, social acquaintance, or something more serious, but proving wrongdoing requires evidence, not speculation. That's why legal experts constantly urged caution while interpreting these files. At the same time, survivors' voices became increasingly central to the conversation. For many of them, the goal wasn't just punishment, it was acknowledgement. Being believed. Being heard after years of silence. Some described how difficult it had been to speak out initially. Fear, shame, pressure, disbelief, all powerful barriers. And when powerful figures are involved, those barriers can feel even higher. This led to broader cultural conversations about how society listens to victims of abuse. Movements advocating accountability gained momentum. Institutions began reassessing policies. Media coverage became more investigative, less deferential. Another dimension of the story involved wealth itself. Extreme wealth can open doors. Elite schools, exclusive events, influential friendships. None of that is inherently wrong. But critics argued that in some cases, it can also create protective bubbles where scrutiny arrives late. And when scrutiny does arrive, it can be complicated. Lawyers, public relations teams, and legal complexities can stretch cases for years. That's not unique to this case, it's part of many high-profile investigations. But here, the visibility made people pay closer attention. There was also discussion about media responsibility. Early reports on Epstein existed long before global headlines. Some outlets pursued the story aggressively. Others hesitated. The reasons vary: legal caution, editorial judgment, resource limits, or simple uncertainty. But retrospect often makes earlier caution look like missed opportunity. Then there's the internet effect. Once documents began circulating online, analysis became crowdsourced. Forums, social media threads, amateur researchers, everyone seemed to have theories. Some were thoughtful. Others crossed into speculation without evidence. And that created another challenge: separating verified facts from viral assumptions. Because misinformation spreads fast, especially in emotionally charged stories. Meanwhile, legal proceedings connected to associates, businesses, and institutions continued. Civil settlements occurred in some cases. Investigations reviewed organizational conduct. These processes are often slow by design. Legal systems prioritize procedure, evidence standards, and due process, sometimes frustratingly slow for the public, but essential for fairness. Yet the pace itself became part of the public conversation. People asked whether justice delayed feels like justice denied. There's also the psychological dimension. Stories involving secrecy, power, and unanswered questions naturally attract intense attention. Humans look for patterns. We want clear narratives, heroes, villains, closure. But reality often resists that simplicity. This case especially sits in a gray area of incomplete information. Enough facts to confirm serious wrongdoing. Not enough clarity for every question people want answer. And that gap fuels ongoing fascination. Over time, another shift happened. The focus expanded beyond individuals to prevention. How can institutions protect vulnerable people better? How should reporting mechanisms work? What safeguards reduce abuse of power? Some organizations implemented stronger policies. Others reviewed past practices. Awareness campaigns increase. None of that erases past harm, but it reflects attempts, imperfect ones, to reduce future risks. Public memory also plays a role. Major stories often fade as new headlines emerge. Yet certain cases remain reference points in cultural discussions about accountability. The Epstein story is one of those. Not just because of the allegations themselves, but because of what the situation revealed about influence, media, justice, and public trust. And trust, once shaken, takes a long time to rebuild. Today, years later, documents are still occasionally released. Legal processes continue in different forms. Academic researchers study systemic implications. Journalists keep revising unanswered angles. But full certainty, that may never arrive. History is full of events where complete truth emerges slowly, sometimes decades later, sometimes never fully. What remains undeniable is the impact on survivors who spoke out, on legal reforms discussed afterward, on public awareness about abuse of power. And maybe that's the lasting lesson. That transparency matters. That accountability requires persistence. And that even the most powerful reputations can face scrutiny eventually. Because in the end, the Epstein files aren't just records of a case. They're part of a larger conversation about justice, influence, and the importance of listening, especially when the voices speaking are the hardest to hear. And yet, even after years of headlines, investigations, documentaries, and debates, one uncomfortable reality remains: closure is rare in cases this complex. For some people, the story feels unfinished. Not because nothing happened, but because so many questions still echo without clear answers. Who knew what and when? Why were certain warnings missed or ignored? Could intervention have happened sooner? These aren't easy questions. And sometimes they don't have simple answers at all. Power structures are rarely transparent. Influence doesn't always leave fingerprints. And systems designed to protect privacy can also, unintentionally, shield wrongdoing. That tension between privacy and accountability is something societies everywhere continue to wrestle with. Legal experts often emphasize a principle that can feel frustrating but remains essential. Allegations require proof. Names in documents aren't convictions. Due process exists to protect everyone, even when emotions run high. But on the other side of that principle are survivors whose experiences are very real, very personal, and often very painful to share publicly. Balancing those two truths is one of the hardest challenges any justice system faces. Another overlooked aspect is the long-term impact on public trust. When people see powerful individuals connected to controversy, confidence in institutions can erode. And rebuilding that trust takes transparency, consistency, and time. Sometimes a lot of time. Younger generations watching these events unfold often become more skeptical. They question authority more. They demand clearer accountability. That shift isn't necessarily negative. Healthy skepticism can strengthen democratic systems as long as it stays grounded in facts rather than speculation. And speculation has definitely surrounded this story. Conspiracy theories spread rapidly after Epstein's death. The circumstances triggered intense debate online. Some theories relied on genuine unanswered questions. Others stretched far beyond available evidence. Understanding the difference matters. Because when speculation replaces evidence, it can distract from real issues like preventing exploitation, supporting survivors, and improving institutional safeguards. Meanwhile, journalism continues evolving. Investigative reporting today uses data analysis, cross-border collaboration, and digital tools that didn't exist decades ago. These methods make it harder for major stories to stay hidden indefinitely. At the same time, misinformation spreads faster than ever. So the same technology that reveals truth can also obscure it. That paradox defines much of modern media. For survivors connected to this case, life after publicity can be complicated. Public attention may bring validation, but it can also reopen trauma repeatedly. Some choose advocacy roles. Others step back into private life. Both choices require resilience. And resilience might be the quiet theme running beneath everything. The resilience to speak. The resilience to investigate. The resilience to confront uncomfortable truths about power and accountability. Because ultimately, this story isn't just about one man or one set of files. It's about systems. About how influence operates. About how societies respond when uncomfortable realities surface. History shows that major scandals often become turning points. They inspire reforms, policy debates, and cultural shifts. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes unevenly. But change does happen. Even if imperfectly. And perhaps the biggest takeaway is awareness. Awareness that exploitation can exist behind respectable facades. Awareness that accountability requires persistence. Awareness that silence often protects the wrong people. That awareness doesn't solve everything, but it changes how future situations are recognized and addressed. Today, discussions around safeguarding, consent, trafficking prevention, and institutional responsibility are more visible than they once were. Not perfect, but more visible. And visibility is often the first step toward change. Years from now, historians will likely study this era the way we study past scandals, asking what lessons were learned and what warnings were ignored. Because every generation faces its own tests of accountability. And in that sense, the Epstein files become less about one chapter in history and more about an ongoing conversation. A conversation about power, about justice, about whose voices get heard and whose are overlooked. The answers may never feel complete, but the questions themselves continue pushing societies toward greater transparency. And maybe that's where this story ultimately lands. Not in perfect resolution, but in the reminder that truth, however delayed, still matters. And that listening carefully, questioning responsibly, and seeking accountability are responsibilities that never really end.